I was greatly saddened to hear of the death of the Right Honourable Sir Gerald Kaufman MP, Member of Parliament for Manchester Ardwick and Manchester Gorton, for an amazing 47 years, building his parliamentary majority up to over 25,000 because of his fidelity, his attention to detail and his capacity for hard work, which until the end was as great as any political figure with whom I have ever been associated. Gerald Kaufman was a friend of mine for more than 30 years, and indeed we had mutual friends and acquaintances going back, in his case, to the 1960s, particularly Harold Wilson, the former Labour Prime Minister, whom Gerald Kaufman served in Downing Street as a press officer between 1966 and 1970. I became a friend of Harold Wilson, and Gerald Kaufman was a storehouse of more stories about the Bevan-Gateskill conflict, about Sir Harold Wilson himself, than anyone alive, alas, until yesterday. Gerald Kaufman and I had very many shared interests. Included amongst them was clothes. Sir Gerald was a real dandy. No one could dress like him. No one would actually dress like him. But Gerald Kaufman always carried it off with real panache. He was, as Jeremy Corbyn said in his fine tribute last evening, a real dandy. He was also a source of jokes, some of them a little off colour, and funny stories, anecdotes like no other I have ever known. I travelled very widely around the world with Gerald Kaufman, spending long concentrated periods of many days, just him and me in some cases. I remember in Geneva, 3 days with Gerald Kaufman. My sides were sore with laughter at his treasure trove of funny stories and gossip. But we had many more serious common interests too. We shared an interest in Pakistan and in Kashmir, that we spent long times together on the road, particularly when he was the shadow foreign secretary, and I used to introduce him as his warm-up act as the greatest foreign secretary Britain had not yet had. Unfortunately, he never got the chance to be the foreign secretary of Britain, and if he had, things would have been very much different. Because Gerald wasn't just a highly principled, highly intelligent man, he was also an extremely courageous one. He made no bones about it that the people of Kashmir, for example, had been the victim of a vast, great, historic crime caused by British imperialism, perpetuated by the Indian Army's brutal occupation of the Valley of Kashmir. We shared a love of Pakistan and Pakistani food. We both regarded the Lahore kitchen, which is the kind of Indian cooking that is now famous throughout the land, even if it's never called Pakistani. It's called Indian mostly, although most of the restaurants are owned by Bengalis. A paradox that Gerald used to point out to me every single time we sat down for a piping hot curry. But I suppose the most significant of our common interests was the issue of Palestine. Sir Gerald Kaufman, a man of the Jewish faith, was a Zionist. He grew up collecting money for the Zionist state. But decades ago, and decade by decade, he grew more strongly convinced that the state of Israel was nothing more than a European colonial settler state. In his words, worse than the European colonial settler state of apartheid South Africa. He explained when I last interviewed him on our RT Sputnik show, which I hope that we can show you one or two of the excerpts from in this broadcast, that Israel was worse than apartheid South Africa because of the proximity of the victims and their victimizers. in South Africa, he explained it was just about possible, for the most part, for the oppressor to maintain a very significant separation between them and their victims. No such separation being possible in occupied Palestine. And as the decades grew on, and as Israel's crimes grew more and more grisly, grotesque, Gerald Kaufman's courage in confronting them, even when earning him the intense hatred of the supporters of Israel, grew more and more bold, more and more forthright. Gerald Kaufman campaigned not just for a boycott of Israel, which he did and followed in his personal life, absolutely. He called for the strongest possible economic sanctions from the international community, from the European Union, from Britain, America, and the United Nations itself, so as he put it, to end the first world economic standards of living enjoyed by that settler state of Israel at other people's expense. An entirely false standard of life based upon the largesse of the United States and the open trading relations and investment by other Western countries. And when Israel invaded repeatedly Gaza and massacred thousands of Palestinian women, men, and perhaps above all children, this served to break Gerald Kaufman's heart. I, being younger than him, was able to take to the roads with repeated convoys to break the siege on Gaza. Gerald Kaufman, with his mighty heart and with his piercing invective, punctured absolutely the big lie that Israel was acting in some way on behalf of Judaism, on behalf of the Jewish people. Gerald Kaufman was that greatest of things, a Jew who could see clearly that the state of Israel was an abomination, was a blasphemy against Judaism and against the historic role of progressive Jewish people in the development of civilization and of progressive thought and action across the world. I don't want to give the impression that life with Gerald Kaufman was always intense and always deeply serious. As I've been thinking about him all of this day, our first day without Gerald Kaufman in the world, I've been laughing at his amazing treasure trove, his fund of stories and of labour history. My last observation is this. Kaufman was that smartest of things, a real political operator. I was sitting next to him in the House of Commons, as I frequently did, when the House was convened on the sad, melancholy day, which still makes me feel sad even now after all these years, the day that the late and great John Smith, the Labour leader, passed away. We were both sitting with tears in our eyes as we listened to the tributes being paid to John Smith, that mighty oak that fell in 1993. I turned to Gerald and I said, "What are we going to do now?" He said, "There's only one thing to do, my dear boy, and it's already happening." He meant that Tony Blair was getting ready to stab in the back his closest friend, Gordon Brown, and run for the leadership against everybody's instincts and everybody's predictions. There was I sat, already 6 years in the House of Commons, utterly naively imagining that no such betrayal could happen. I said to Gerald, "Tony Blair can't run, not against Gordon Brown." And he said to me, "Life is full of these little betrayals." in politics. Tony Blair went on to betray everyone, including Gerald Kaufman, in the role that he played in international affairs. I like to think if Kaufman had been in the Foreign Office, or even if he'd been, which he probably marginally might have preferred, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, because nobody knew more about culture and media than Gerald Kaufman. He was virtually Hollywood's man in London. He once began a speech at the Parliamentary Labour Party with the immortal words, "As Betty Davis said to me," and the entire audience began laughing. No Labour Member of Parliament in all history could have begun a speech with the words, "As Betty Davis said to me." Kaufman never turned against Tony Blair in the way that I did, but he came to realise that the invasion and occupation of Iraq had been the greatest blunder, maybe crime and blunder, that any British government had ever committed. And I include in that the crime and the blunder of the handing of the land of Palestine to the settlers so that they might then call it Israel, and the long Calvary of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. I'm very sad actually talking to you, although I'm happy, proud to have been able to call the late and great and Right Honourable Sir Gerald Kaufman MP my friend for more than half of my life. Gerald, I salute you. Welcome back to Sputnik. The Right Honourable Sir Gerald Kaufman PC MP has been in Parliament nearly 50 years, but before that was a brilliant journalist and an assistant in Downing Street to the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson. If Labour hadn't been out of power so long, he would have been Foreign Secretary, and what a difference to the world that would have made.
Gerald Kaufman's relatives were murdered in the Holocaust, and he grew up an ardent supporter of the State of Israel. Now he is the clearest, most authoritative voice against the crimes committed by that state and for justice for their victims. Last week in Parliament, he said it was time for international sanctions against Israel and spoke of the Sea of Misery in the Gaza Strip.
It's a privilege to have him with us on the Sputnik today. Sir Gerald, your speeches always travel far. They have such authority and such clarity, but none more than the speech you made on Gaza last week. You're no stranger to Gaza. You've seen at first hand that sea of misery. Tell our viewers about it.
I led a delegation of 60 parliamentarians from 13 European parliaments to Gaza not long ago. It was a year after the attack by the Israelis, which failed, as all Israeli attacks now do, though with huge loss of life, called Operation Cast Lead. A year afterwards, the smoke from the white phosphorus bombardment by Israel was still fuming away. People say rightly that the Syrians use chemical weapons. Nobody condemns the Israelis for using chemical weapons. Well, I do.
The massive military destruction is, of course, compounded by the economic misery. The blockade means that no meaningful economic activity can take place there. The tunnels through which some means of life were passing have been destroyed on the Egyptian side. And I think you were describing in Parliament the condition of life of those Palestinians who have survived these military attacks. Tell us.
Scarcely any food is allowed to be brought in. So everybody, but particularly the young people and the children, are undernourished, which affects them so much that it will go on to future generations. They have hardly any fresh water just for a few hours every 5 days, so they're diseased in that way. They have no fuel of their own, which means, apart from anything else, that a great deal of the transport now is by horse or donkey. There's hardly any electrical power. Indeed, on a recent summer, because there wasn't enough electricity for air conditioning in nearby Tel Aviv, they cut off the electricity in the Gaza Strip, and Qatar had to intervene and see what it could do, which wasn't enough. No building materials are brought in, so that the schools that the Israelis destroyed, in some cases with children in them, cannot be rebuilt. Medical facilities are at their minimum. If any other country on earth was doing what the Israelis have been doing to 1.7 million Palestinians in Gaza, there will be United Nations resolutions, there will be calls for intervention, there will be sanctions, but the Israelis literally get away with murder.
I'll come back to sanctions in a minute. Now, you're Jewish, your family suffered, some perished in the Holocaust, the greatest of all crimes, which took place in the 20th century, perhaps the greatest of all crimes ever. And you grew up a supporter of the State of Israel. What changed your mind?
As you say, George, I grew up a supporter of the State of Israel. I was brought up as a Zionist. I went to Israel again and again and again on holiday. I had family there. I had friends there. But as I traveled around, because it's a small area, I would see not just Israelis in Israel living in huge comfort, subsidized by the Americans. I would see settlers in the illegal settlements living in huge comfort. And minutes away, I would go to a Palestinian township or village and see sewage flowing through the streets. And if you have any sense of justice at all, and as a Jewish child I was brought up with a sense of justice, the disparity is unacceptable. And it's got worse. It's got worse and worse and worse the whole time. And the Israelis live in comfort. I've gone through Tel Aviv and see them sitting at their pavement cafes, complacently enjoying themselves, while hardly any distance away, the people in the Gaza Strip are living in total misery. But let's forget the people on the West Bank. They're living in misery as well.
Now, of course, it is routine for Israeli propagandists to pray in aid the suffering of the Jewish people in the Holocaust. You reject that as a cover, don't you?
I reject it with utter contempt and anger. Most of my parents' families, because my parents came here as refugees, most of my parents' families were murdered in the Holocaust. When the Germans came to the town from which my mother came in Poland, Stashov, they lined up all the Jews to march to the railway station to be put in cattle wagons. But for those who were not well enough to march, they killed them on the spot. And they killed my grandmother, who was ill in bed, by shooting her in her bed. My grandmother did not die to provide cover for Israelis murdering Palestinian grandmothers.
Well, it's hard to put it any more powerfully than that. Let's turn to what can be done about it. There is, of course, a civil movement of boycott and fight for divestment and even individual sanction. But you went further in your speech in Parliament last week. You say it's time for international, official, governmental sanctions against Israel. How would that work?
The Israelis have a very high first world standard of living. That standard of living depends partly on huge financial subsidies by the United States under the spineless Barack Obama, and every politician pretty well in the United States yields to the Jewish pressure groups, and that's why they daren't do anything about it, even if they wanted to do something about it. The European Union is inactive. The British government is inactive. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, described the Gaza Strip as a prison camp. But it so happened that he said that when he was visiting a Muslim country, Turkey, and wanted to ingratiate himself with his hosts. Hardly anything is done, which is why lots of people, including me, take part in boycotts. But the boycotts, while important, are insufficiently effective. What we need, and what I press for and will go on pressing for, is governments, the United Nations, the European Union, the United States, our own country, to impose economic sanctions so that the Israelis can feel what international opinion means. There's no point in condemning them. There's certainly no point in appealing to their better nature, because they don't have a better nation. You've got to make them suffer, because that's the only way they will feel anything. And economic sanctions would erode this huge first world standard of living which they enjoy on borrowed money.
What you described earlier was an apartheid system. I'm one of the few people on the left who was ever in apartheid South Africa. I was there underground for the African National Congress. And the situation you described of the settlers living in great comfort whilst the indigenous owners of the land live in utter misery. Apartheid was broken between the hammer of the struggle of the African people and the anvil of international solidarity, including sanctions and boycott. Do you think that such a move is going to have an effect, and if so, when?
I, too, when I was Shadow Foreign Secretary, visited South Africa under apartheid as the guest of the South African Council of Churches, and I was followed everywhere by South African secret police. There is a huge difference between the apartheid that the Israelis are inflicting on the Palestinians and the loathsome and odious apartheid that existed in South Africa. There were distances, considerable distances, between Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, and the South African, the African townships. In Palestine, it's minutes between the settlements or between Israel behind the 67 borders and the hell that they've created in Gaza and on the West Bank. So it's worse. It's worse even than the foul actions of the South African apartheid government. You've got to make these people feel it. I'm not optimistic, but I'm realistic. Nobody ever expected the Soviet Union to collapse in the way that it did, but it happened. Nobody ever expected apartheid in South Africa to collapse in the way that it did, but it happened. The Israelis are stupid to imagine that just because they've got the fourth largest armed forces in the world, they can go on like this. I learned Greek at school, and there's a phrase in the historian Thucydides which says "panta rei," and that means everything flows. The Israelis are balmy, complacent, and self-defeating to imagine that they can go on forever as they're going now.
Sir Gerald Kaufman, a privilege to talk to you.